Thank you. And for the last presentation, quite hard thing to follow. That was excellent. So let me get started. I'll give you the whole story to begin with, tell you about a concept I came up with a couple of years ago, right the way through to the development, deployment and user testing of a minimum viable software product. I'll then show you a recorded demonstration of that software in use, and then talk through some possible next steps for it. So it all began a couple of years back, early 2018. I'm not really sure, I don't recall exactly what the stimulus for the concept was, but the idea was to have a digital map or a globe that responds in the background seamlessly in real time to what you're saying, grabs the locations and pans across and zooms in to show you those locations on that digital map. So later that year, I think it was July 2018, postgrads in Newcastle were offered a two-day training course intended to fairly broadly increase our impact. That could take a number of forms, that impact. And there was a subsequent opportunity to pitch for some funding to pursue an idea that we might have, for example, a business idea or research. And in October that year, I decided to use this concept. I pitched for funding to pursue it as a software product. So I presented a video of the concept, which was intended to show what the software would do if it were implemented. So I had just over a month of funding granted, and through the pitch and discussions, we determined that classroom teaching, probably in the secondary school, sixth form sector, was a suitable user market for the concept. And the funding was to take this video of the concept, a kind of prototype, to teachers around the country to conduct some market research. In fact, an actual basic software prototype was developed later that year, and I was able to use that actual software prototype within the market research at 6 different locations throughout the UK. So a couple were in the northeast. The numbers are the order in which they were carried out, in fact. 3 in Cornwall, which is my home county, where I grew up, so I have some teaching contacts down there. And then finally, a school in Cheltenham. So the sessions were structured as semi-structured interviews, focus group sessions these were, and then a demonstration of the prototype, and then a section at the end where teachers would provide some feedback on the prototype and make suggestions for improvements. So to summarize some of the feedback from the teachers, part of it was about their teaching, their core requirements, what they had to get across in geography and history lessons, which are deemed most relevant to the concept, and then also about the prototype itself. So let's focus on that. So they identified that it would be a useful attention grabber, get students involved, help with general spatial orientation, especially on a global scale, get to know where countries are, could have good impact, and outside of geography and history lessons in politics, for example. Be pretty good for inspiring students through novelty lessons, and help the teacher to move around the classroom if it was the teacher's voice that was being interpreted. And they suggested that actually, for it to be of high impact, then it has to be underpinned by good quality background mapping, specific to the content being taught. And teachers should be able to customize these maps, annotate, drill down into data. And above all, it has to be reliable or it's going to be abandoned. A couple of paraphrased quotations from the teachers. So following the market research, I pitched for further funding to take the prototype into a minimum viable product, MVP. That took place over January, February earlier this year, had a couple of months of time to do this development and then subsequent user testing. Now, COVID got in the way of this, and what I decided to do was, rather than delay user testing, deploy the software I developed online and then do some remote user testing. And I've done a bit of that since that deployment. I have, I think it's a 3-minute video of me using the software.
Let's start by activating voice recognition. And now you should see a transcript of my voice down here in this field. Okay, so most of you listening and watching today are probably based in the United Kingdom. And it might be that you go to France for your holidays, or maybe you go to Spain, or perhaps Italy. In any case, let's talk more about France. So we have centered on our screen mainland France, the biggest polygon for that match, that country match of France. Could also show all polygons, that one match. And now we get Guadeloupe, Martinique, and the French Guiana, for example, all displayed on our screen. Let's go for the last 3 matches and talk a bit more. Perhaps we mention Spain again, or maybe the United Kingdom. And now we have all polygons displayed for all 3 of those matches. Okay, let's clear our map and enable Cloud API matching and set a spatial remit of the United Kingdom. So we only want to match things in the UK. And then let's reactivate voice recognition. So I am based in Newcastle upon Tyne, specifically in Benwell, on the west of the city. Okay, now let's match everything and clear, same spatial remit. Soon I'm going to be traveling to Cornwall, but on the way I'll go via, let's think, Somerset and Devon. And I'll pass close to the towns and cities of Exeter, quite close to Oakhampton, Launceston, Bodmin and Truro. So the blue regions are the gazetteer matches, and the pink rectangles are the bounding boxes for the API matches.
Okay, so what's next? So there was a fair bit of feedback from the teachers, and I need to address some of those points. In particular, ability to annotate the mapping, and drill down into data, and also some reliability aspects I need to work on. Some of those things will take a lot more work than others. There's also a possibility, thinking about scaling it, of avoiding the use of APIs for the named entity recognition and geocoding, and rely purely on gazetteers, which are specific to themes or a particular curriculum within education. It's going to avoid ongoing costs of APIs. So what I use in this software is free versions of some APIs. But if you want to scale it up, then there's a significant cost to that, and there's also a higher risk of false positives when you're using third-party software such as that. And perhaps it's better to allow a user to select which gazetteers they want to activate within their instance, so they only get matches relevant to what they're talking about. I'm also considering whether I should open source the project and recruit other skills and make it into something a little bit larger. I'm open to questions, comments, suggestions on any of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Thomas. That was very interesting. So let's see if we have some questions from the audience. The first one from Joe. This is very cool, and I agree. Could you add historic map data to this to enhance student understandings of empire, etc.? Perhaps to set, sorry, I was reading and the chat moved. Perhaps to set a date range if a particular period is being studied.
Yeah, that's a good point, and a popular point with teachers, especially clearly history teachers. Definitely there's this spatial orientation and teaching, but then also spatiotemporal. And for example, movements of borders, frontiers within Europe in the 19th, 20th century is an example of that. Yes, definitely the difficulty I have found is in getting hold of good quality historic mapping. Anyone knows of good resources, please let me know. I do have a set of background maps selectable within the software, which I didn't demonstrate. Also some overlays on top of that. So for example, overlays would be roads and railways, background mapping, for example, imagery, aerial imagery, satellite imagery, or geology layers. But certainly historic mapping, yes, to show, to be very relevant to curricula and to show the temporal variation as well as spatial. Yeah, thanks.
So Joe says that they can help. Joe, if you want to send your contact to Thomas, that would be great. There are a couple of suggestions by Phil. So he says, great stuff. For the next steps, have you considered using TTS so the VocalGeo app can talk back to the user? So text-to-speech synthesis.
Okay. No, I had not considered that. The interface allows an editing of the transcript, but that's not what you're saying. You're saying they can type things in, I think, and then it speaks back to you. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah, I think Dave, Phil can clarify. Yeah,
map
so,
user. Okay. I wonder what sort of okay. What's the scenario here? What kind of things would the map need to say to the user for the user's benefit? Sorry, this is a bit of a discussion rather than a response to a question. That's maybe not very useful of me. Trying to understand the match.
Yeah, for example, there are 3 places to match. Which did you mean? So I think what's hinting here is the ambiguity of natural language in terms of place names.
Interesting. So yeah, with respect to that, okay. So ambiguity, an example is Washington. Washington State, Washington DC, and you have Washington that's just south of Newcastle. In fact, so 3 options for matches. That ambiguity, that's a real issue, and in fact, that was one of the motivations for having a spatial remit. So that actually, if you choose the UK as your ROI, then you don't get the first 2 examples, Washington DC or Washington State. You just get the one in Newcastle. I can see how that there would be value in the software speaking back to the speaker in support of that. But I'll have more of a think about that. It's not something I considered. So thanks for the comments.
Yeah, so Phil also has a couple of papers that you might find interesting. They're in the chat if you want to make note of them. There's another question from Labib. Can this voice commands integrated with other API for delivery systems route planner?
Well, no, it can't right now. I have not developed it for that, but I suppose it could. I think there's a risk, or it might move away from the original objective, which may not be a bad thing, but may not be within scope. The idea isn't to reproduce or do something similar to what inbuilt software on devices allows, such as choosing a location, having Google Maps show you where to go. It's something that should ultimately be a background, seamless, real-time process that isn't distracting from you as a presenter or a teacher. So certainly, it could be developed to support that kind of thing. I'm not convinced if that's the way I want to go with it.
So Joe is suggesting that for historic maps, pelagios.org is a start. So that's a fantastic digital humanities project that actually collects a lot of digitized resources, including place names, historic gazetteers, boundaries, and so on. And I do think that for history, this is one of the, I would say, one of the best applications, showing how boundaries change over time and so on.
Right.
Another suggestion from Bruce, the National Library of Scotland, and British Library Old Maps, so they seem also to have relevant resources. Okay, so Phil was saying that the map could tell the user about the population, or having more like a conversational approach. I think you already addressed that.
Yeah, so teachers did mention being able to use census data, map census data, and one teacher talked about using hill shading to understand terrain features, and that to help them visualize feature identification on maps with contours, and looking at population densities and linking that to terrain and population census data, and drilling down into that data. Yeah.
Another question from Nick Behrman. You mentioned a globe originally. I'm guessing a 2D map is a lot easier. Are you aiming for a 3D globe long term?
That hasn't been a particular objective. It could be that I use a different kind of projection. It could be that it's on Google Earth, use Google Earth or something similar. There's other software that can help with that. I don't know what the benefits would be of having a 3D globe that you're looking down on versus projected map. There's been a point has been made, or a suggestion from a teacher was, when you get to a location, being able to switch into, for example, Google Street View to get more of a feel of that new region, for new experiences. So then you should break straight into 3D with well, obviously what you see on Google Street View, or just show photographs on some panel of the area that's been matched. So I'm not sure if I want to go any more, well, I really want to go into 3D, but potentially a globe that spins, which should be more useful as you're zoomed out than when you're zoomed in, I think. But I'll think more about it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question myself, and I was thinking, particularly as a user of Alexa, the error rate is quite high, and I'm wondering, in terms of place names that often have irregular pronunciations, or that can be quite difficult to detect for this kind of system. What is the error rate that you think would be acceptable for an actual application?
Yeah, error rates, there's a problem. Especially with the APIs I use, which is understandable, and a reason for having the spatial remit, so you can limit it right down. There are often matches for places that are correct matches, but way off other parts of the world. What is acceptable? I think that's going to come down to user testing and having it in a real classroom scenario. The user testing I've done so far has just been with the teacher alone, not with students. I think more thorough user testing will determine that. I have a feeling that there'll be quite a low tolerance for false positives. About precision, so I'm not sure. I think, the question is missing something that it should have got as bad as getting something that shouldn't be there? So this is comparing precision and recall. And I think there'll be low tolerance for errors, maybe more tolerance for missing something. But I think, as I say, user testing will determine that.
Yeah, that would also be my impression, and definitely my tolerance for Alexa is very low. And when she plays wrong songs and so on, so I would argue that probably maximizing precision over recall is a good strategy. So in the chat there are more suggestions for data sources. So if you that looks highly relevant. So another question from Johnny Huck. Could there be scope for incorporating vernacular, non-official place names, or perhaps even learn about vernacular place names through interaction with the users?
Yeah.
So, for example, if the system doesn't know a place, the user can define it, and with enough definitions, it can be understood in the database.
Definitely. So part of this is about having user-defined or customized gazetteers. Now, in that is high demand on their time. The other thing is about training your software to better match what the user needs. But that still involves some user inputs, unless you have a very swish interface for that. So the question then is how to allow the user to recognize the errors and make corrections within their time constraints and their training, if you like. Bearing in mind, it doesn't have to be limited to the teaching user group, but their time is highly constrained. And I'm not sure of a reasonable way of integrating their feedback into improving the matching. And I wonder whether it's perhaps needs to be placed on someone else, the burden of developing gazetteers based on, for example, transcripts of common lessons, and whether it's feasible to have their feedback improve gazetteers or a machine learning model. But it's definitely a good idea. If there's some way of doing that, I think it could be really good. Yeah.
Great. So any more questions? We have a few minutes left. Yeah, as a last comment from my part, I was thinking that you thought about this in the context of teaching, but there might be other contexts where this kind of system might be interesting. Because I almost see it as well, I wouldn't quite say an art installation, but it has that vibe of a really interesting interactive experience. If you think of projecting the map on a large screen and so on. So Bruce has another question. Machine learning is certainly the way forward to improve gazetteers fed by digitized text documents.
Yeah, sure. So I've done a little bit of work in annotation of text for identifying entities and then training machine learning model from those. And it does involve user input and user time in my experience. Definitely doable. Yeah, I'll give it more consideration.